Protests are taking place in Australia's capital as Prime Minister Scott Morrison delivers his start of the year speech. Demonstrators are calling for a change to Australia's reliance on coal and fossil fuels. Morrison says he will not shut down Australia's coal sector despite large bushfires burning around the south of Canberra with smoke covering parts of the capital. Well, Andrew Thomas has more now from Canberra. Andrew, there's been a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister during this summer and this fire season. What has he had to say in this speech?
Well, after 6 weeks of fires, Stan, as you say, and these horrific fires that are unprecedented in Australia, and Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, was criticised for his handling of the crisis. He went on holiday to Hawaii as the crisis was getting going at the end of December. So this was his chance to reset the dial, essentially, and lay out his priorities for the year. And the response to the fires was front and centre of his speech. Now, he talked a lot about how Australia needs to adapt and to mitigate for what he essentially described as inevitable climate change. Hotter, drier summers are going to cause more fires in the future, he said, and that climate action, in his words, was about mitigation and adaptation to the inevitable. He talked less about addressing climate change, and when he did, he said that Australia was doing its bit. It was meeting its commitments under the Paris Accords, for example. It was bringing down its emissions. But what he was very reluctant to address were the coal exports, particularly, that Australia sends to the rest of the world, which, of course, don't put up Australia's emissions, but do put up emissions elsewhere. This was his response when he talked about that.
The only thing that matters is the cumulative impact of all countries' emissions. You will also not reduce the number of coal-fired power stations in the world today by forcing the shutdown of Australian coal mines and Australian jobs that go with them. Other countries will just buy the coal from somewhere else, often poorer quality with greater environmental and climate impacts.
Well, I'm joined now by Tom Swan from the Australia Institute. You've done a report looking at Australia's fossil fuel exports. Just tell me where that puts Australia and its responsibilities vis-à-vis climate change.
There's absolutely no question. Australia has an oversized role in fuelling climate change, mostly through the fossil fuels that it exports. That's overwhelmingly coal, both steel coal and power coal. These exports put Australia third in the world in terms of fossil fuel exports. That's behind Russia and Saudi Arabia. So while the Australian government likes to say it plays a small role in causing climate change, in reality it plays an enormous role, and it has a huge opportunity with these bushfires to take a stand internationally to do something about it.
Scott Morrison consistently, again in the speech he just gave, said that Australia's emissions are just 1.3% of global emissions, as if to say Australia is not a big player, but even so it's still doing its bit. Is it?
Well, it's certainly not doing its bit. Its targets are too low, and it's only planning to meet them based on state government policy and dodgy accounting tricks. But even putting that aside, 1.3% is still very large. It's larger than 40 other countries, each of which have a bigger population than Australia. And even then, it doesn't include all of the coal and gas exports that go out of Australia. Australia is the third biggest exporter of fossil fuels, and Australian governments currently plan to double our coal exports. So Australia plays an oversized role in fueling the crisis that is itself fueling the bushfires we're experiencing right now.
New mines are being approved, a big one in Queensland, the controversial Adani Carmichael mine. Other mines are being expanded. You were telling me a moment ago that some of the legislation actually prohibits those approving these from considering the overseas emissions. That sounds remarkable. Explain that.
That's right. So in New South Wales, the state that's been most badly affected by these bushfires, right now there is New South Wales government legislation under consideration that would limit the ability of independent planning decision makers to consider climate impacts from coal exports. So they would be unable to consider the impacts like the bushfires from the coal exported from mines they're considering. It's astonishing.
Tom Swan, thank you very, very much. Well, the unprecedented bushfires have put climate change front and centre of Australian politics once more, but for the time being, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, doesn't show any signs of changing his overall stance when it comes to emissions and indeed to coal.
Andrew Thomas live for us there in Canberra. Thank you.